So picture this. It's 1945. The world is breathing this huge sigh of relief. The United States and the Soviet Union, the allies who just brought down Nazi Germany, are the two biggest powers on the planet. But believe it or not, in just a few short years, that whole alliance is going to completely fall apart. It shatters, and it plunges the world into a totally new kind of conflict, the Cold War. So how did it all go so wrong so fast? Let's get into it. Okay, so at the absolute heart of this breakdown were two visions for the world that just could not coexist. On one side, you've got the US. Its economy is booming, it's the only country with the atomic bomb, and it wants a world built on capitalism and democracy. On the other side, the Soviet Union. It was absolutely devastated by the war, but it had this gigantic army, and its #1 goal was to create a buffer zone of friendly communist states in Eastern Europe to make sure it could never be invaded again. These goals weren't just different, they were on a collision course. So that's the big puzzle, right? How do you go from being allies fighting a common enemy to becoming these bitter rivals for decades? Well, the answer is in this rapid-fire series of bad diplomacy, strategic power plays, and just a whole lot of escalating fear. And the crazy thing is, the first cracks in the alliance started to show almost immediately. They showed up at the very conferences that were supposed to be planning for peace after the war. I mean, the speed at which things fell apart is just stunning. At Yalta in February 45, everyone's still trying to play nice, but you can feel the tension brewing, especially over Stalin's promises for free elections in Poland, promises he wasn't really planning to keep. Fast forward just 5 months to Potsdam, Roosevelt is dead, Truman is the new president, and the whole mood has soured. Truman casually mentions a new superweapon, they're fighting over how much Germany should pay, the rift is wide open. By 1946, it wasn't a secret anymore. And then, Winston Churchill comes along and gives this new reality a name that sticks, the Iron Curtain. And it wasn't just a powerful metaphor, it perfectly captured this very real, very physical, and ideological barrier that was now slicing Europe in two, separating the Soviet-controlled East from the capitalist West. So with the battle lines clearly drawn, the United States had to come up with a whole new playbook, a foreign policy that would end up defining its every move for the next 40 years. And that playbook was called containment. Now, here's the key thing to get about it. Containment wasn't about attacking communism where it already was. No, the idea was to just stop it from spreading any further. The guy who came up with it, George Kennan, basically argued that the Soviet system was fundamentally weak, and if you just contained it, like a virus, it would eventually collapse on its own. This became the absolute bedrock of American strategy. And they didn't waste any time putting it into practice. The Truman Doctrine basically said the US would support free people anywhere, and they kicked it off by sending military aid to Greece and Turkey. But containment wasn't just about military muscle. You could argue the Marshall Plan was the real genius move. It was this incredible economic strategy to pour money into rebuilding Western Europe's democracies, making them stable and prosperous, and therefore pretty much immune to the promises of communism. And when we talk about this aid, we're not talking about pocket change. We're talking $12 billion. That's over $100 billion in today's money. It was this massive, massive investment. And it sent a crystal clear signal that the US was taking the economic side of this fight very, very seriously. The Soviets, of course, saw it as an economic attack and forbid any of their Eastern European satellites from taking a dime. Okay, so this is where the theory becomes a real high-stakes standoff. It happens in Berlin, which was this little island of Western democracy deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany. In 1948, Stalin decides he's going to force the Allies out, so he cuts off every single road, rail line, and canal into West Berlin. It was a massive gamble, a direct test of Western resolve. And the West's response? It was absolutely audacious. For almost a full year, Allied planes flew supplies into West Berlin 24/7. A plane was landing every few minutes, bringing everything from food and medicine to coal for the city's 2 million people. It was an unbelievable logistical achievement and a huge symbolic victory. Stalin had made his move and he lost. He lifted the blockade in 1949. That whole Berlin crisis had this huge, lasting consequence. It convinced the Western powers that they needed to formalize their military alliance. So in 1949, NATO was born. This really solidified the two opposing sides. Its core promise, Article 5, basically says an attack on one member is an attack on all of them. The lines of the Cold War were now drawn in permanent ink. But just as these alliances were hardening in Europe, two shocking events in 1949, people called them the Twin Shocks, would blow this conflict wide open. turning it from a European standoff into a truly global nuclear-armed struggle. You really have to see how quickly one thing led to another here. It's like a chain of dominoes. First, in August, the Soviets get the bomb. Suddenly, the US isn't the only nuclear power. Terrifying. Then, just 2 months later, the world's most populous country, China, falls to the communists. For leaders in Washington, this was an absolute nightmare. Their response was a top-secret memo, NSC 68, that basically called for a gigantic military buildup. And just 2 months after that, their new policy was put to the ultimate test when North Korea invaded the South. The Korean War became the first hot war of the Cold War, and it was just this brutal back-and-forth slugfest. The North Koreans invade and almost win. Then the UN, led by the US, counterattacks and almost wins. But that provokes China into sending hundreds of thousands of troops pouring over the border, pushing the UN forces back again. And after 3 long, bloody years of fighting, the war ends in a stalemate, right back where it started, with Korea split in 2 at the 38th parallel. So while all this is happening overseas, this new global military struggle, that fear starts to seep back home into the United States. The fight against communism abroad suddenly turns into a frantic hunt for communists at home. And it was the government itself that was leading the charge. President Truman started this loyalty program that investigated millions of federal employees. And the scary part was the standard for getting fired. You didn't have to break a law or commit treason. You could be fired just for being disloyal, whatever that meant. It created this chilling atmosphere where thousands of people just quit their jobs rather than live under a cloud of suspicion. And then you get these huge public spy trials that just throw gasoline on the fire. The case against Alger Hiss, a high-ranking former diplomat, fueled this terrifying idea that communists had infiltrated the very top of the US government. And then the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, a couple executed for passing atomic secrets to the Soviets, that just seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears about a hidden enemy living right next door. And right into this perfect storm of fear walks Senator Joseph McCarthy. In 1950, he gives a speech and makes this absolutely explosive claim, waving a piece of paper in the air. He says he has a list of 205 communists working in the State Department. Now, spoiler alert, he never actually produced a credible list, but it didn't matter. The witch hunt had begun. And for 4 years, McCarthy's power was immense. He held these hearings, made wild accusations without any real evidence, and absolutely destroyed people's careers. His downfall, though, came when he finally overreached. He accused the U.S. Army of being soft on communists. The hearings were televised, and for the first time, the American public saw his tactics up close. They saw him as a cruel, dishonest bully. The spell was broken. The Senate officially censured him, and his reign of fear was over. But even with McCarthy gone, the damage was done. The Red Scare created this suffocating climate of fear and conformity. If you disagreed with the government, you were seen as disloyal. It was used to target everyone from labor union organizers to civil rights activists to Hollywood actors. It was a really dark time for American liberty, and it was all fueled by the anxieties of this new Cold War. Which really brings us to the big takeaway here. Think about it. From NATO, which is still a major military alliance, to the permanent division of Korea, to that lingering political paranoia we still see today, the events of these first few chaotic years really did set the stage for the rest of the 20th century. So the question we're left with is, how much of that world, built on those alliances, divisions, and fears, is still with us right now?